So this is a essay with some helpful ways of thinking about various things within AWS. The limits of AWS. Here's a quotation from the philosopher Timothy Williamson, the logician. We care not just how things are, but how they could have been otherwise. About possibility and necessity, as well as actuality. And that's a key theme in many of the concepts that people struggle with AWS. We have part 1 called Limits on Action, part 2 Self-imposed limits, part 3 Limits on Possession. Direction of fit. There's a man walking around the aisles of a supermarket with a shopping list in his hand. His wife has instructed him to buy certain items. There's also a detective watching the man as he moves about the aisles, putting items into his basket. The detective is making a list of all the items that the man puts into his basket. There's a list of items in the hand of the detective. There's a list of items in the hands of the husband with the shopping basket. Each list might contain exactly the same items. What's the difference between these lists? To bring out the difference, consider situations in which the list disagrees with reality. Specifically, consider where we suppose the mistake to lie. If his wife were to say, "Look, it says butter, and you've bought margarine," he'd hardly reply, "What a mistake, we must put that right and alter the word on the list to be margarine." If the detective's record and what the man actually buys, if they do not agree, then the mistake is in the record. So in the former, the mistake is not really in the record. You wouldn't scribble out the item on the wife's list, but it is a mistake in the record with the detective's list. AWS have now developed a complex and sprawling set of resources. Some misconceptions have arisen regarding access control. The premise of this essay is that some of these misconceptions are quite recurrent. We therefore go to the effort to name some of them. Many consider the naming of misconceptions to be a waste of time, since we should simply dwell on the correct conceptions and pretend the incorrect ones never occurred. Well, defining misconceptions enables potential solutions. Future tutorials on IAM and NACLs can preempt the misconceptions. If we preempt them, we increase the amount of people in the world with the correct conceptions. To this end, some really common false beliefs, FBs, are named in the appendix, and we're going to address each of them in turn as we go through this article. First, a purge of the pedantic matters. Limit comes from Old French, ultimately it's from Latin, just as the word boundary is. Etymology is therefore not particularly enlightening if you're after some vivid contrast between the word limit and boundary. Here's a dictionary definition of limit. It's the greatest amount, number, or level of something that's either possible or allowed. We'll look at things which are possible or allowed. This occurs with IAM, which is Identity and Access Management in AWS. Administrators allow principals to perform a set or a subset of actions. That's how it works. And this means that from the principal's perspective, only a subset of things are possible. In mathematics, limits are very important. For instance, a limit is the value that a function approaches as the input approaches a certain value. Traditionally, boundary was distinguished from bound. We're still on that purge of pedantic matters. It might be made in this way, the distinction. So bound is the limit itself, or furthest point of extension. And maybe an imaginary line, that's bound. But boundary is the thing which ascertains the limit. Terminus, not finis. The Statute of Connecticut sets out that inhabitants of the towns are to mark out their bounds using rocks, ditches, and other boundaries. So the boundary is the thing which ascertains the limit, the marker of the limit, if you want to make that distinction. Connecticut is where a mathematician called Stephen Cole Kleiner was born, in Hartford. Anyhow, bound and limit, they're usually interchangeable. In a few cases, limit will not work, even though boundary will. For example, the boundary between fact and fiction in her writing is often blurred. You couldn't just use the word limit there instead, could you? The Una River forms a natural boundary between the two countries. Limit won't work because perhaps there's a definite point where fact ends and fiction begins. We just can't know what it is. Thus we say the boundary between the two is blurred. So if we were to say limit, we'd suggest that we know what it is. I'm not sure there's much in that. I'm here suggesting that limit implies that we know, that we have knowledge of where the end point of something is, and boundary doesn't, but I'm not sure if we can work that. In some cases, boundary will simply not work, simply won't work. In Shakespeare's Richard III, we get this line from Sir Ratcliffe: "Dispatch, the limit of your lives is out." To use boundary here would suggest we're interested in an afterlife. By using limit of x, it's clear we're interested in x and not whatever is beyond. Mathematics has a place for bounds too. Someone on a forum has said that the difference between a limit and a bound is this. This is from Stack Exchange. Limit is a local property. In other words, limit of f of x, as x tends towards a of x, as it tends to a, tells you something about the behaviour of ff around AA. While boundedness is a global property. That is, it tells you something about the behaviour of ff over its entire domain. Suffice to say, we could tease apart differences between the words limit and bound if we so desired. We're often implicitly talking about limits when we ask, what am I capable of doing? What can I do? The words maximum and minimum also signify limits. The purge is now finished. Now we can say I know when pedants foist on us the observation that the words are not strictly the same. Okay, limits on action. We sometimes use the term capacity. This denotes what somebody actually does. But the limits. This denotes not what someone actually does, but the limits of what can be done. So capacity is a useful term for limits in the specific context of action. When we know about the capacity of a thing, we know something about limits. When we say the packet is bound to the internet, we are saying something about what the packet is doing. It is heading towards the internet, at least. Consider the expression, the packet is bound for S3. Here we are saying that a packet is heading towards S3, and usually will not continue beyond S3. It's reached its limit. Firewall terminology. Nothing should be inferred from my choice about which terms are put on the left or right hand side in this table, but here we have a few contrasts. We've got the term blacklist and the term whitelist, the term allow list and the term deny list, the term explicitly and the term implicitly. Sometimes people use this expression by default as opposed to not by default. And we're going to have a discussion about what the opposite of by default is. Inbound and outbound, and actually versus potentially. There's just a few contrasts there. Consensus is that 1, this distinction between blacklist and whitelist, those two terms is being phased out. for example, see some of these sources, like the decision made by Twitter in 2020. Therefore, I'll predominantly use the terms allow list and deny list in this paper. An allow list is the historical whitelist, and a deny list is the historical blacklist. And following the specific guidance in Twitter 2020, I'm going to opt to use allow list and deny list in the ways they use them. These are single words with no initial capitalization. I avoid using camel case, so I'm not going to put allow list with a capital L and a capital A. I avoid using a space. If a doorman had a piece of paper with the names of 10 individuals who are to be denied entry, he would have a deny list. He would have a blacklist. If his paper had only those VIPs allowed entry, he would have an allow list. He would have a whitelist. These two concepts, allow list and deny list, are usually defined in terms of what is made explicit. Explicitly enumerate enemies and you have a deny list. Explicitly enumerate friends and you have an allow list. Now those historically predominant terms, blacklist and whitelist, have been used as verbs. For example, authors of an AWS Solutions Architect textbook write, security groups, this is 2021, security groups use a default deny approach, also called whitelisting, so it's like an activity, an ing word, which denies all traffic that's not explicitly allowed by a rule. Here, whitelisting is a verb. It's a present participle. Indeed, many people often talk of whitelisting being an approach, a strategy. For example, introducing AWS WAF in 2015, Nate Dye had a slide talking about two strategies. He said there was a comparison to be made between two rule strategies. He called one negative, where we allow by default and we block known bad threats, meaning we explicitly name the threats, and positive, typical of a restricted site, we block by default and we allow those good entities that we know about. We know what we are allowing. So he's given an example of the positive rule strategy. Allow Seattle office IP range. So this is for internal communication in a company like Amazon. The Seattle office, they have their IP addresses explicitly mentioned to be allowed. Or you might do it by header. You'll allow the referrer header example.com. If you're using the negative rule strategy, you might block. This is a production deployment, so it's a product. You want people to use it. You don't need to know who they are if they're going to use it. So you can block known malware. So an IP range where the IP addresses belong to malware that's been identified by people who publish lists on that. And he's written here block and then a semicolon in braces. So we have the negative strategy using a deny list and the positive strategy, which is just allow list. If I said to you, you've been deny listed, then this would mean that you have been denied access by a rule. If I said to you, you have been allow listed, then this means that you have been put on the list that explicitly allows people access. We've seen then the blacklist and whitelist were used as verbs, and they were usually transitive verbs. For example, blacklist John Smith. However, the verb might be used without an object. So someone might say, hey, you need to blacklist, but this is rare. The same applies to allow list and deny list. Individuals might be allow listed or be deny listed. Whenever the terms are used as verbs in this way, expressing things done to a person, the person features in one of the explicit rules. I'm just explaining how we use the terms. So when we say X has been deny listed, we're saying there is a rule that explicitly mentions that person. To say you've been deny listed means you're denied. There is not opportunity for ambiguity here. To say you've been allow listed should cause somebody to proclaim hooray because they have access. So these are success terms. To say you were allow listed is to say you were allowed. To say you were deny listed is to say you were denied. It might make sense for somebody rejected by the bouncer of an exclusive members club to complain, "The bouncer allow listed me." This is because the cause of their rejection was indeed the allow list. The person was not explicitly allowed by one of the rules, hence their rejection from the club. I mean, we can conceive of it, but these terms are not used in this way. They are success terms. To say I have been allow listed is to say, 1, that you have been allowed, and 2, you were allowed by an allow list. Nevertheless, there's something we need to keep in mind when we use the terms as nouns. When we talk about an allow list, noun, we are referring to a list that, on the whole, denies. Allow lists deny. Counterintuitively, a deny list tends to allow. A deny list is not a list that denies by default. A deny list pinpoints individuals for denial. Finally, note that generally the notion of matching is going to be very important in access control. When we move on to IAM, we will see that the concept of an implicit deny amounts to being denied access without matching a deny rule. That is, you're being denied access, but you've not been featured in a deny list. Even CloudTrail talks of events matching trails. So they say when an event occurs in your account, CloudTrail evaluates whether the event matches the settings for your trails. Only events that match your trail settings are delivered to your S3 bucket and your Amazon CloudWatch logs log group. CloudWatch events talks of events matching an event pattern. That's how they talk. You've matched this particular event pattern. This concludes our discussion of the first pair of terms, blacklist and whitelist, and the second pair of terms, allow list and deny list. Now on to that third contrast, implicit and explicit. According to the dictionary, if something is implicit, it is understood, although not clearly or directly expressed or conveyed. There's implication, assumption, or question. Many discussions use the adjectives implicit and explicit. The things which we are going to use these adjectives to describe are denies and allows. It might seem strange, but it is common to talk about the deny. I suppose it's the act of denial. So those are the things we describe, acts of denial and acts of allowing, as being implicit or explicit. So, for example, we have implicit denies and explicit denies, as well as implicit allows and explicit allows. And remember, if something is implicit, it involves implication, assumption, or question. Access control policies are sets of rules. In fact, it is possible to understand the implicit-explicit distinction in terms of the existence of rules. The key question is there a rule? The existence of rules. Does a rule exist? The answer to this question will help us determine whether a particular allow was implicit or explicit. If there is a rule covering the entity which was allowed, then the allow was explicit. If the entity is allowed, but there is no rule responsible for this, then the allow was implicit. We might formulate it this way. So the explicit action is one where there is a particular rule that accounts for that action, and the implicit action is the one where there is not a particular rule that accounts for that action, where action is just allow or deny, the act of allowing or the act of denying. Notice how I talked about a rule covering an entity. And this notion of coverage has been really helpful. When a rule covers an entity, the rule has validity for that entity, and the entity is within the scope of the rule. Now, let's look where we are. Earlier, allow lists and deny lists were defined in terms of what is made explicit. In other words, that second distinction between the term allow list and deny list was defined in terms of the third pair of terms. We then defined the implicit-explicit distinction. And to do this, we talked about the existence of rules. We can therefore say that the allow-deny list distinction is itself ultimately rooted in the existence of rules. However, this starts to be problematic if a firewall simultaneously has rules blocking enemies and rules allowing friends. This occurs with NACLs, as we'll see later. A NACL might have a very wide-ranging rule which attempts to allow everything. It also has a highly specific rule which denies a particular individual. It will be the case that most entities are allowed, and their being allowed is attributable to a rule. In this respect, we have an allow list. Okay, most things are allowed because it's a wide-ranging allow rule, and we can attribute it to a rule. And remember, we put the implicit-explicit distinction in terms of, is there a rule existing? Yet, it's far from clear that we have an allow list. Not least because the majority of traffic is allowed in this NACL. The majority of traffic is allowed. Yet, as we noted, allow lists tend to deny. Because remember, they pinpoint a few individuals, usually, to be let in, a few VIPs. So allow lists, on the whole, deny. So the question is raised, how do we decide whether we have an allow list or a deny list? Okay, so on the one hand, we've got a highly specific rule which is denying a particular individual, and that would suggest we have a deny list. It will be the case that most entities are allowed, and their being allowed is attributable to a rule, and because we're attributing it to a rule, it's an allow list. So there's an argument for it being a deny list. It's highly specific what we're denying, but because we can attribute that what we do allow to a rule, it's an allow list. But it obviously can't be both. So let's try and work this out. We might say that the allow list deny list distinction is truly couched in terms of the smaller proportion. If you're allowing in a minority of all the entities in the universe, then you have an allow list. If you're denying a minority, you have a deny list. We have then two different accounts, the rule existence account and that universe account that we just talked about. A case to test our intuitions might look like this. We have a rule that allows end users from North America. We have another rule that allows users from South America. And we have another rule that allows users from Oceania. In fact, in this thought experiment, we have a rule naming specific regions for all the regions in the world, except Europe. There is no allow rule for users in Europe. Europe is denied. In the above situation, we are denying a minority of entities in the universe, because most of the world is allowed after all. However, no rule exists which names Europe and denies Europe access. What do you think? Do we have a deny list or not in that situation? I think I would say we have an allow list. If I had to choose, I'd say we have an allow list. I know that most people in the world are allowed on that list, and usually with allow lists We don't actually allow most people, usually we allow a minority, but I think it's this existence of rules thing that would win out here. A final comment on these two terms, allow list and deny list. An allow list is not necessarily a list which is incapable of having deny rules. This idea of being incapable of having deny rules should be kept distinct. An allow list merely chooses not to use deny rules. Similarly, do not conflate the concept of a deny list with that of a firewall incapable of having allow rules. The chief meaning is that we are selecting, pinpointing, distinguishing a minority to block. The majority is allowed. That's the chief meaning of a deny list. It's probably more accurate to describe allow list and deny list as strategies. The expression by default is problematic for reasons I will explain later. This is an adverb. It's a way you do something. For example, this firewall denies by default. What does it mean to deny in this manner? Sometimes the intended meaning is precisely that it implicitly denies. At other times, the intended meaning is that it denies until you reconfigure the existing rules. Because of this ambiguity, I will try to avoid that adverb by default. In AWS IAM, at least, I believe the following two sentences express the same idea. 1. Principals are denied access by default. 2. Principals are implicitly denied. We see this in a snippet from the user guide, so I think they're the same thing. So the user guide says an implicit denial occurs when there is no applicable deny statement, but also no applicable allow statement. Because an IAM principal is denied access by default, they must be explicitly allowed if they're to perform an action. Otherwise, they're implicitly denied access. So there we have that running together of the idea of an implicit denial and being denied by default. Here the authors set out two conditions that must be met for an implicit denial to occur. First, there must be an absence of explicit denies. Second, there must be an absence of explicit allows. So two things need to have vacated the scene if we're to say an implicit denial is in place. In the second sentence, because an IAM principal is denied access by default, in the second sentence the author is outlining the necessary conditions for action. The claim is this: for action to occur, an explicit allow is required. Nothing less will do. An implicit allow is not a coherent notion in IAM. The above paragraph suggests that denial by default and implicit deny are the same idea. It's perhaps in NACLs, Network Access Control Lists, which protect subnets in AWS, in NACLs where we see the idea of by default and implicit start to peel apart. The reason is that NACLs have something called the default deny, an indestructible rule which lurks at the bottom of all NACLs. We might configure our NACL so that the DD, the default deny, can be effective, denying all traffic. We could configure it so that it's effective in that way. In such a case, the denies are accounted for by a rule, so we cannot justifiably describe this as an implicit deny. There's a rule. It's not implicit, is it? There's a rule denying things. So what we have is something special. It's an explicit denial because there's a rule by default. Finally, throughout this paper, we're going to draw on 6, the distinction between actual and potential. These are two ways of being, and I think this can be a very helpful distinction to invoke when thinking about limits on AWS. An acorn is actually an acorn and potentially an oak tree. A rock is not potentially an oak tree. So the acorn has a property which the rock lacks. The emphasis throughout these notes is going to be on the fact that pointing out these potential features is in fact very important. It is not true that potential features hold of everything. If you take the invocation of potential properties as invocations of unscientific hand-wavy fluff, then important information will be lost on you. For example, permissions policies deal with actual permissions, and permission boundaries in AWS deal with potential permissions. Okay. Access control policies. Two sorts of AWS firewall are often contrasted with one another. These are known as security groups and network access control lists, or NACLs. A mechanism for access control is provided by both security groups and NACLs. SGs protect elastic network interfaces, the vulnerable part of EC2 instances which connects them to the network. NACLs operate at a different level. They protect subnetworks rather than individual EC2 instances. What follows from the fact that a NACL is an access control list? Well, let's explore the concept of an ACL. John Barclay wrote a paper in 1997 comparing the ACL method of controlling access with another method known as role-based access control. Barclay is going to start by asking how we might distinguish role-based methods from ACLs. So, RBAC being distinguished from ACL. John Barclay of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, he's using the ACLs used in Windows NT as an example, and he writes, RBAC is distinguished from ACLs by the inclusion of a feature which allows a session to be associated with a proper subset of those roles. If you think about it, roles require sessions, periods of continued connection. On the whole, Barclay is pointing out that RBAC methods, role-based access control, are not very different from ACLs, especially in terms of the processing required. However, he notes that most role-based access control models have features which most ACLs do not. In particular, with role-based access control models, we have role hierarchies, where one role can inherit the other. But Barclay also points out how this idea of role inheritance can work with ACLs. One can think of role inheritance as the capability for one role to be authorized for another role. You could think of it in that way. The equivalent concept with ACLs is the capability for one group to be a member of another group. This means that ACLs can achieve many of the things that roles achieve. Barclay is writing in 1997 and relies on the work of an earlier author, Sandhu, 1996, to set out 5 properties required for RBAC, role-based access controls. He calls this conception RBAC 0 and claims that an even starker conception, RBAC M, involves only the first 4 properties. So here are the 5 properties involved in role-based access control. 1. You have 4 entities: users, roles, operations, and sessions. 2. You have associations between the role and the operation. You have an association between the user and the role, because it's not good enough to know the role and what it's doing. You need to know who's using the role to do that. So you need 3, an association between the user and the role. It's kind of the other side of the role. But then you need an association between the user and a session, this continued period of connection. And 5, this is the extra one, you need an association between the user's session and a subset of the roles authorized for the user. And this subset is termed the active role set. The big claim made within John Barclay's paper, which presumably needed to be made in 1997, was as follows. Any access control policy described using ACLG can be described by role-based access control M, minimal. And any access control policy described using roles can be described in ACLs. This is important because it means that neither method can achieve some arrangement that the other can also achieve. It might be more efficient to achieve certain policies using one method, but if our concern is which policies are possible, then both the ACL and RBAC methods are on equal footing. Note that Berkeley's claim is about ACLs which can use groups as entries. When he writes ACL with a subscript G, it's simply an ACL which can have groups, and not just individual users. So groups as entries in that list. NACLs on AWS are Network Access Control Lists. Within AWS, your VPC is essentially a network, but NACLs do not protect whole VPCs or whole networks. Instead, they protect particular subnets. Do NACLs associate users with sessions? No. Is that true? They therefore lack, I think that is true, they don't. They therefore lack one of the 5 features enumerated by John Berkeley. This tells us that NACLs do not provide role-based access control, and gives you an idea of why they are called network ACLs. They do not track sessions, they are not stateful. To fully understand NACLs, we need to appreciate a number of features. NACLs are configured by modifying the rules which they contain. The behavior of the firewall is altered by modifying a list of rules. The rules are numbered. Remember the alliterative expression, NACLs numbered. Make an effort to remember that lower numbers are lucky. They get priority. Lower numbers lucky. LL. Rule 100 will be assessed before 200. This is because 100 is lower than 200. Lucky for you, 100. This means that if Rule 100 allows all traffic and Rule 200 denies all traffic, then all traffic will be allowed. Notice how a single item of traffic can be covered by more than one rule. We can call this ability for a single packet to be accounted for by multiple rules concurrent coverage. That's what I'm going to call this phenomenon. So concurrent coverage, the ability for a single item of traffic to be covered by more than one NACL rule. It's as if multiple rules can refer to a network packet. Of course, for any given network packet, only one rule will take effect, and this is determined in part by the priority principle. Remember, the rules are numbered. There's something else we must note about NACLs. Every possible packet must be accounted for. Every possible packet. The NACL must take a position on every possible item of traffic in the universe. This is not as demanding as it sounds. Rules can be very general indeed. For example, a NACL rule can simply allow all traffic. You don't write in specific IP addresses, you just put in all. However, we must take a position on everything. Only 2 positions can be taken, allow or deny, and we can call this requirement that every packet be accounted for using rules exhaustive coverage. So, exhaustive rule coverage, the inability of an item of traffic to not be covered by a NACL rule. We've now made a start with the properties of NACLs. We've looked at the priority principle, which states that rules must be numbered and lower numbers are lucky. The principles of concurrent coverage, whereby a single thing is covered by 2 rules. And exhaustive coverage. Some rule must take effect for everything in the universe. NACLs, like all access control lists I've seen, have allow rules as well as deny rules, or they can. This option to reach for a deny rule as well as an allow rule allows the NACL to be flexible. We'll continue next time.